What's your experience of information getting to President Trump that didn't fit with maybe his overarching narrative or the direction you felt he was going to?
There's always been this tension between intelligence and policy. So intelligence is a profession, much like journalism, where you see the world the way it is. So your job is reporting what is happening. Whereas policymakers see the world the way they want to see it. There's this natural friction. So the reality is that there have been very few presidents who've been incredibly enamored with their daily intelligence briefer. President Obama, for example, once told his intelligence briefer that when you walk into the room, you suck out my decision space. Because, here you are, you're thinking that, the sky is blue and the intel officer is saying, nope, it's really gray. So to be clear, this friction has been happening from the beginning of the creation of an intelligence community. It's the way it is. It's actually very healthy, so I think the difference now is that we have far more understanding about that relationship. We know that President Trump didn't always like to hear what it was that he didn't want to hear, but he's not alone in that regard. Maybe there's more bluster, maybe there's more said, but he's not the first who's not been happy to hear what it is he has to say.
Welcome back to Navigating Noise, the podcast. We are delighted to be speaking to Ellen McCarthy, who's the CEO of the nonprofit Trust in Media. Welcome, Ellen. It's really a pleasure to have you, to get to know a little bit more about your work. Could you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you spent a couple of years at the State Department as the Assistant Secretary of Intelligence and Research there. A fascinating area of the State Department that I'm sure our listeners would love to hear some of the backstory on. But what did you do before that and coming out after us? Let's just start there.
That's great. And first, thank you so much, Jonathan, for hosting me and providing this platform for me to talk a little bit about the things that matter to me. It's almost like counseling. Yeah, I did end my career in government at, working at the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. I'll tell you, though, I think the path there was really, really interesting. I started as a reporter, actually, for a newspaper in Annapolis, Maryland. And from there, I got sucked in to the intelligence community. I started at the Office of Naval Intelligence. Just to give some context, it was the Cold War. Hunt for Red October had just come out. We were very focused on Soviet submarines. And the opportunity to be an all-source analyst, I really thought I'll just try this for a couple of years.
So what year was that then?
So
The Hunt for Red October?
Dating myself, but it was 1988. I started.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was very young.
Yeah. Well, I was very young too. So.
Yes, of course. We were both. Yeah, we were all young.
But I'll tell you, I went into ONI, as a submarine analyst and never left. It was, I loved my time in the U.S. intelligence community was brilliant. I loved it, loved every minute of it. But I didn't stay at ONI. I would move around quite a bit. I would move from D.C. to work at a more tactical level, supporting the Navy in submarine operations. And when the Cold War ended, things got kind of boring. We were not tracking Soviet submarines anymore. And it was the war on drugs. So the U.S. Coast Guard recruited me to come in and help set up their intelligence capability and certain intelligence collection capabilities. So I spent a few years at the Coast Guard. And it was just an amazing time. Then 9/11 happened, and I would move to the Pentagon and support the Secretary of Defense at a group called the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence. Would leave from there. I did policy and strategy and security and human capital while I was there. Not all source analysis, but really important to understanding the business and how the intelligence profession operates. Would leave to run a nonprofit called the Intelligence and National Security Alliance. I mention this only because I suspect your viewers and listeners know that the national security sector could not operate without the private sector. And so this group, INSA, was made up of 2,000 companies that provide capabilities to the U.S. intelligence community, had a chance to get a better understanding of what motivates the private sector, how they work, how does innovation happen. Would get recruited back to run operations at a place called the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA.
Sure,
So that's
yeah.
a collection agency that works satellites and mapping. Um, would leave again because it was just my time to be done, and would run a company that was a for-profit that was working in the cyber threat intelligence space. And then I would get the call back to run the Bureau of Intelligence and Research at State. And I had to tell you, Jonathan, that when they first called, I thought it was a joke. I really thought I was being spammed because I had never been particularly political or engaged in the political space, and yet I was being called back to a political position. And I was a little nervous about that, not because of the politics, but because I truly believe that intel officers, at least my experience was I'd spent my whole career supporting all administrations. And so I was a little nervous about that, but I'll tell you that it was very quickly, I was not nervous when I left. It was the most amazing opportunity to work at State Department, to work for Secretary Pompeo, to run the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, one of the smallest all-source intelligence organizations in the 18 agencies of the IC, but they are the best. And so that's, that is a walk down memory lane. Thank you for that opportunity.
Yeah. Well, that's fascinating. I guess there's like uh, I'm also just like fascinated by INR as someone who's like not from that community, been in academia. It does actually feel like INR is like they're more like my academic colleagues than they are like the others that we interact with. And so there does seem to be a special culture there on it, and being able to kind of really dig in and do some like longer term research as well, as far as I could tell, as well as I'm sure like providing the urgent requests for information and things along those lines. But like, all right, so I'd like you to say a little bit more about what makes INR unique to some extent. There, but also, I guess another question here, and maybe a little bit of a provocation, is your background in journalism seems interesting in that you move from journalism into intelligence analysis. And what we found was like we work with journalists, and we have some engagement with the intelligence community as well, is that they're often doing very similar things. Obviously there's a different readership for it, a public readership and a very private readership on it. But how would you compare and contrast a journalist and an intelligence analyst?
I'm so glad you asked that question because the one experience I haven't talked about is the one that I'm actually pursuing now, which is this effort called Trust in Media Cooperative. And I'll tell you that I think that your question is spot on. That the differences between the role of media, sort of in the private sector, and the role of the intelligence community in government are very similar and require very similar skill sets, very similar kinds of people. And things have changed certainly since I started in 1988. The intelligence community really is their main mission is providing their customer or their client. So, the policymaker, the president of the United States, or the Secretary of Defense, or the warfighter. In my case, it was submarine operators. Or when I was in Coast Guard, it was for, coasties. We're doing law enforcement operations. My job and the job of my community was to provide them with what we call decision advantage. So it was to provide them with information that would help them do their job, no matter what their job was, targeting submarines or developing policies, sanctions. And if you think about it, the role of journalists and the role of media is really very similar. It is the role of media to hold institutions accountable, to help people make decisions, to help people understand what's going on, to help them lead their lives. So it's a very, very similar um, uh, career path. I think what has changed over the last few years is that intelligence, is still focused on providing folks with decision advantage. But the media sector has changed so much with, the digital age and social media, and now with artificial intelligence. And, what motivates media outlets is very different now. It tends to be revenue. It tends to be pushing information to people that supports the narrative that they've got. They're no longer, the media sector is no longer that sort of third leg that is in place that's meant to hold institutions accountable. And so that has changed so much. And so that's one reason why I've launched this cooperative to really focus on bringing together the media sector and academia and technology and other nonprofits to identify ways that to put more focus on the production of quality information and to give people who are interested an access to quality information, tools and resources and education programs. It's not about content moderating. It's not about fact checking. It's about raising awareness about what is quality information and what does that look like, and giving people, empowering people to be able to search for that. So that's how I think they're very, very similar. I think looking at the intelligence community, however, it too has gone through its own challenges over the
Mhm.
last 30 years that I've been working in and around it. While I still believe the intelligence community provides the most eye-wateringly beautiful analysis that is out there, I would argue that its impact on policymaking is not quite as much as it used to be. Sort of similar to the media sector right now, just a different problem, but a similar outcome. And that I think the value that the IC is providing its customer is not as great as it was during the Cold War era. And a lot of that is because of sort of what's going on in the digital age. There's competition right now.
So I'm kind of curious. You brought up something about like quality information here, and the name of the organization is Trust in Media,
Mhm.
and thinking that sometimes, like at least the media that we see and interact with, there can be low trust in it, but they're also producing high quality information. And it does seem that trust and quality information, there can be a little bit of a gap between it. So what are, I mean, particularly from your like the vantage point of both what you experience within the intelligence community and within media, what are the major like drivers or determinants of whether your audience or your reader trusts you?
It's very interesting. We work very closely with Gallup, and my cooperative is now roughly 2,000 people organizations. Gallup has been, but we've really leveraged some of the research they've done, as well as actually Edelman on trust. And the reality is, we live in a time right now where trust in all institutions of democracy has just been declining. Gallup has been following this for 50 years. So since the 1970s, trust in the military, trust in religion, trust in schools, trust in health has been declining. But interestingly enough, the organization, the institution that's had the most precipitous decline is the media. And it is at the lowest level it's ever been. Gallup's last report indicated that 32% of Americans have absolutely no trust in media, and that's traditional media, social media. No trust, the lowest it's ever been. And Jonathan, I think it's not gonna be the lowest. Next year, we're gonna have an even lower number. And,
Yeah.
but interesting to note, the two sort of institutions that, actually, the one institution that's not been on the decline, and one that I think we need to put a lot of focus on, is local. Anything local, local
Mm.
media, local government, small businesses. So local is not experiencing the most precipitous decline. And relating that to my experience at INR, it kind of makes sense. And to your question of trust, that when you know somebody, when you have a relationship with someone, when you engage with someone, when you're in the room when decisions are being made, that's how you create trusted relationships. And
Mhm.
with the awakening of the digital age, information is now being produced and pushed from entities that we don't know, from very far away places. And so we don't really have those trusted relationships. And so as I look at INR, and I am INR's number one fan, it really hit me that the reason that I think INR is one of the most impactful, and right now, the biggest measure that we have for INR, it's not the best measure, but it's the one that we have, so we use it, at least when I was there 4 years ago, was the number of articles that INR produces that go into the president's daily briefing. So the
Mhm. Yeah.
PDB is the the platform upon which the president, the cabinet, and other senior officials receive, the most sensitive, the intelligence that's produced by the entire community. So the PDB, and more articles that come from INR go into the PDB per capita than the other two all-source intelligence organizations, CIA and DIA.
Yeah.
And why is that? It's because they're just really good. And why are they so good? I believe it's because of these trusted relationships they have. So an INR analyst sits in State Department. Those analysts sit with their consumers. They sit with the bureaus and the Secretary of State, with the ambassadors. They're in the room as policy is being made. There's these trusted relationships. The analysts at INR and actually all the intel people at INR understand what their consumers need, what their priorities are. That doesn't mean that they're feeding them intelligence that fits their narrative, but just that proximity, just that relationship, just their small size set them apart. CIA sits in McLean, Virginia. DIA sits in Bolling Air Force Base. They don't have that same level, that same relationship. And so it's much harder. And by the way, I'm not criticizing it. That's by design how all source analysis was done. This fellow named Sherman Kent, back post-World War II, indicated that analysis should be done separate from policy to maintain its purity and to not be biased.
Yeah.
But I think now we look and we realize that, wait a minute, INR, the proximity of INR's analysts to the policymakers and the trusted relationships that come from that really makes a difference. This was a long answer for a short question.
Yeah. No, but that's super interesting. And it actually kind of like reminds me of two things I know you have looked into particularly about what they kind of major, like why people trust information is sometimes like format and timeliness there, and such that if you're there close to them, literally what format to put it in. And then also like how to get it to them in the right amount of time, and such that like proximity to them is like that relationship they can actually be translated into a higher quality product as well.
I think so. I think when you have an understanding, when you have an understanding of the needs of who you're producing for, again, that doesn't mean, so right now what we have based on, how algorithms are developed is that we're pushing information to people based on an understanding of what they want to hear. So it creates these echo chambers, which is further fueling, sort of this mistrust in the system because we're not getting a complete picture.
Yeah. So, yeah. But I mean, in this context, how have they, to the extent that you can really share with us this, integrated some of the more advanced analytical tools? Obviously, there's been a push in so-called artificial intelligence and integrating that across the IC, particularly in helping them leverage open source intelligence. There has the integration within INR been pretty smooth? Have there been bumps? Where's the pushback that comes from INR on these issues?
This is where I think that INR doesn't just represent the history of the intelligence community, but represents the future of the intelligence community. So, just a little history. INR actually got its origins within the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS. And again, for your listeners, that's the OSS really was the foundation, the origins of how our intelligence community operates today. Run by a guy named Wild Bill Donovan. World War II, President Roosevelt wasn't convinced that he was getting the intelligence or the information that he needed to make decisions about entering World War II and then operating in World War II. So he set up this special branch run by this guy who was a Congressional Medal of Honor winner, very famous military officer who also ran for governor, was very successful from a business perspective, had great relationships with foreign powers. So Wild Bill set up the OSS, the sort of little extra government thing that wasn't connected to all the other bureaucracy, which meant that they were a real target, by the way. The OSS was very scrappy. In fact, Wild Bill tended to hire people that were smart and could win at bar fights. I mean, And so so they were this little thing that didn't fit into the bigger government architecture and was mostly not respected by the architecture, but hugely successful. Out of the OSS came our current Central Intelligence Agency, our current Special Forces capability. Measures of success for OSS. The biggest one is there's this one metric is that the war would have continued for 5 to 6 months had the OSS not been doing what it was doing. So a very unique and special part of our history. The 1,500 analysts in OSS moved to the State Department in 1945. When
Okay, wow.
President Truman wanted to disable the OSS, take it apart, Wild Bill convinced him that these analysts should move someplace. We shouldn't do away with them. In fact, he said to the president, what won this war was good old-fashioned intellectual sweat. That was the
Mm.
analysts of INR. So I know it's a long walk down, but I think it gives you a sense of who INR is. So that's their origins. And so they're still a little bit scrappy. They still operate. They're not as big as CIA and DIA, which is roughly 10 times their size. As I mentioned, they're co-located with the policymaker, and they even have a different sort of personnel trajectory. Most analysts in INR stay in their area for 17 years on
Okay, wow.
average. By comparison, the other intelligence agencies, people stay in their position for 2 to 3. So these people really love what they do. They're not wed by culture or technology. They still, for the most part, they operate with unclassified, publicly available information. They're researchers at heart. So while they operate in the very sensitive classification areas, for the most part, they still start their day basically doing research, which is a very different part of their trade craft than some of the other agencies. And so as we look ahead at how can we better incorporate open source into the intelligence business, INR is a great place to do that because their people already work with open source information. Well, the beautiful thing about open source is, it's amazingly rich. Like we've never had more data, but there's also challenges with it in terms of how the intelligence community is able to leverage it. There's ethical issues, there's security issues, and also there's sort of just cultural issues. If you are somebody who has always worked with information that comes from national technical means, that's how you work. This concept of incorporating new data
So
sources.
national technical means, can you define that?
So if you only work with classified imagery that was collected by satellites that were built and operated by other government agencies,
Sure,
or
yeah.
if your option is to work with human intelligence that was collected by operators on the ground, or something that came from a social media site, you know, you're going to go with the information that you trust. You know how it was collected. There's a little more risk in the intelligence community in terms of the impact of getting things wrong. And so
Mhm.
the culture is such that people are much more comfortable working with classified sources that came from places that they know they can trust. Whereas, working with Bloomberg is just a little different. So, the biggest issue I think with the incorporation of OSINT into the intelligence space is really people. So, an INR is not weighed down with sort of with some of those issues. And so I really believe that, as we start a new administration, we start with, some new folks that, INR will really be looked at as a great test bed for incorporating some new capabilities, some new ways of doing business, because it's just so brilliantly poised to bring these capabilities in much more easily.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that raises an interesting question here, and insofar that you can kind of give us a sense about like what will be the role of the intelligence community in a Trump administration. Obviously, there's been a lot of discussion about some of the appointments there among the community, and I mean, how downstream of an effect does like Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence on an analyst sitting and trying to like figure out what's going on in Russia or Iran or China. Like, how big of a culture shift does that, and where does it translate down to the individual analyst?
So it's much smaller than it's much smaller than we read or hear. The reality is that, as I mentioned, having served 33 years in the intelligence community,
Yeah.
you know, uh, administrations changed every 4 years. I mean, even when incumbents stayed, they still changed. There was new leadership. And for the most part, the impact that has on the workforce is minimal. It's really not as you think. The men and women of the intelligence community are doing their jobs. They're still doing amazing work. And you know, I whether it's Tulsi Gabbard or anyone, for the most part, you're not going to see ginormous changes in the day-to-day operations of our analysts, our collectors. I mean, what does change with that is the president is going to come in with his or her own priorities. The DNI is going to pivot to ensure that the community is supporting those priorities. So
Yeah.
whether it's great power competition that becomes our focus, and working countries like China and Russia, or so that's where things change. You may pivot to support changing priorities, but in terms of how you do your job, that doesn't change very much. I will say that that also sort of how the community runs, how we the business side of intelligence really is up for some change and refreshing. And so this is where, I'm always excited by a new leadership team coming in. I would love to
Mhm.
see, agencies like INR get more investment, get more focus to do the things that they're doing. And that's something like Tulsi or whoever, she'll have some impact on that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. Well, let me just try this out. Is that the like what the Trump administration is focused on, what they've like, or the incoming Trump administration and those who seem poised to play a role, doesn't seem to be like a radical departure from a lot of priorities, such that like countering China's influence, and that seems to be like more or less a bipartisan, agreement that like we see them as an aggressor in many ways, and maybe even more so than we say publicly at times. And like Iran's highly problematic, a regional actor, and those seem clearly to be poised to be policy priorities for. Of course, there's the Ukraine issue that don't want to minimize that because that has structured a lot of work, but also I think there's somewhat of a danger of overstating the change there. Am I wrong in that?
Right, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, the reality is that our foreign policy has not changed tremendously in I haven't tracked it, but I'll just say 20 years. It really has not changed much, regardless of administrations. It's largely been the same. And so, to your point, countering China was very big during the Trump administration, and I would imagine will continue to be big. I haven't seen his national security strategy or his defense priorities, but I imagine that it'll still be top of list. I mean, what does change is how we use resources to achieve those priorities. So it really gets to, how do we do our jobs? Where do we align resources? For one president, focusing on Latin America may be big. For another president, maybe not so much. So how do we realign resources to meet the objectives that are laid out by the president? And that's what changes. And that's where the DNI plays a tremendous role, because he or she is overseeing 18 agencies. And so that's where you might see some change.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that, I mean, that seems to like that would impact the individual analysts, is all of a sudden like their area that they've worked on has fewer resources to some extent, even if it doesn't mean like their job disappears. Of course, there is like a question over what the Trump administration will do around new policies and approaches to the career civil servants in the government. That's certainly got to be unsettling to them. But but what you're saying suggests that there is some impact at that individual analyst level.
let me give you an example based on my experience. So when I came into INR, I had mentioned that there was 1,500 analysts in 1945 that moved to the State Department, and yet when I started at INR, 75 years later, there was under 300 people there, and so I'm thinking, what happened? And as I did
Mhm.
some research, I saw that over time, INR's budget and resources had been declining like by little bits over 75 years, yet their production and their impact has been increasing. And that really
Yeah.
struck me. Why is that? And part of it really gets to it's not very sexy, but it gets to the management of INR. How does INR communicate its resources? How does it work with the State Department bureaucracy? How does it work with Congress? How does it work with now the DNI? And so, I really put a lot of focus during my time on, really looking at where INR's strengths were, where its weaknesses, putting together a strategy. Again, it's like business 101, what what does it need? What will the outcome of that be? And starting to communicate that within state to OMB, to the DNI. And I'll tell you that we put together a 5-year plan that resulted in additional personnel, additional resources, and additional dollars. Not a lot, because I'm not one who believes that we need to bloat the budget. I am a responsible taxpayer, but I could very much see. I think my background that I laid out for you earlier put me in a place where I understood where we needed to make investment and how we could get investment. It was as simple as that. And my successor, Brett Holmgren, followed that plan and has continued to invest in INR in ways that had not happened very consistently over the 75 years before. The DNI was incredibly helpful in that regard. When Sue Gordon was the principal deputy DNI, I was able to work with her and her team and leverage her. Even with some of her successors, there was a lot of churn. I was able to work with them to get support for some of the things that I needed done. That's the kind of thing that the DNI does. And and so, yeah, there's no question that there will be change. There's no question there will be churn. There's no question that there will be folks that are happy and not happy,
Mhm.
because, when you move, people don't like it when you move resources. So,
Yeah.
for
Yeah.
example, counterterrorism is not your number one priority, and you move resources from the National Counterterrorism Center to INR. There's a winner and a loser there. And so that's where you'll see some churn.
I mean, that's kind of helpful, and it does, like, highlight some of the, like, let's just say, more boring aspects of it, the stuff that, you're not going to read about often in the newspaper, but in my experience now seem to, like, matter more in it, is the, like, people who and, like, there's a way to take this, like, it might sound negative, particularly there's a cynical reading of it, like, people who are masters of the bureaucracy, who, like, really know how to work the system in such a way to get an optimal outcome for their team and for the people they're supporting, seem to matter more, or at least I appreciate it more when you, like, run into those people, and it's like, "Oh, this is someone who knows how to get things done." And, of course, from, like, an outsider perspective, you're like, you wish it wouldn't take that kind of skill and craft to work the system that way, but I don't really know a big system that's not that way. Whether it's, like, university bureaucracy.
Every bureaucracy has that. I am a huge fan of this concept called the Director of National Intelligence. The DNI was put in place to oversee. It was a post 9/11 decision to create this entity that really is focused on integrating the now 18 agencies of the IC. I think what's happened is that, the big agencies tend to get the most focus, like anything. So, CIA, the National Security Agency, the big six that we call them,
Yeah.
tend to get the most focus. They have the biggest budgets. They have the largest impact on our national security. They are the big six for a reason. But I don't think that should come at the expense of the other 12 who are smaller and also are also highly impactful to this national security mission. So I'm a huge proponent of diplomacy as a lever of national security. And so I think that INR is actually I think they're the best. It wasn't just because I worked there, but I think they
Mhm.
are, the best value for the taxpayer dollar and worthy of time and investment. And so I would say to Tulsi Gabbard when she comes in, please put some focus on, the smaller elements that are at energy, that are at Department of Treasury doing foreign, investments, that are at INR doing policy. The smalls actually are worthy of some time and some focus. And I haven't seen a DNI do that yet, but I hope that she or whoever moves into that position which will do that.
Well, it makes some intuitive sense in that, like, relationships with the principal, the president, matter. And who can get that in front of him probably matters more than in other cases. That if you are supporting ultimately a Secretary of State and the Secretary of State has a strong relationship with the president, you're going to, so from outsider perspective, it would make sense you'd have more impact. And then like seeing these like all these other agencies, whether it's Treasury or Energy, who have elements of the intelligence community that, yeah, that they should play just, maybe a bigger role. Of course, there's probably always going to be a role for these big organizations like the CIA, the NSA on it. But, I guess it's just proximity to power. And those relationships are going to matter a lot, and maybe even matter more to the type of leader that Trump is. A very like, it seems like a very like relationship driven, visceral one. We often like cash it out in terms of loyalty there, which have problematic elements, of course. But like, but if you just look at it from a systems perspective, some of those are bound to become more important. Don't Wouldn't you say?
I mean, I think that, either I'm not I believe the part of the success that I had at INR and my successor had at INR was very much related to the relationship the secretary had with the president. I have
Hmm.
to tell you that Secretary Pompeo always had my back. If I needed something, he was always there. He expected things of me, of course, but in terms of my vision for INR and and the relationship he had with the president really helped. Henry Kissinger said, "Where you sit is where you stand." And so that's, that definitely, was the case. But I think looking forward on, with the DNI. So the DNI, part of the challenge of being a DNI is you're also expected to provide the president with his daily briefing. And so, there's been this pull with your job in supporting the president day to day and your job integrating 18 agencies of the intelligence community. And I'll tell you, one of those is more important than the other. So if the president calls, you're there. And yet, we really do need to have, and this is again, I look at this new administration and I really hope that they are given the chance to put more focus on integrating the 18 agencies, not at the expense of CIA and NSA and NGA, because they provide incredibly important capabilities, but also to include the other smaller elements that also are doing amazing work but aren't getting the same focus.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to slightly shift around the same topic here, and I didn't think we were gonna like when we sat down. I didn't think we'd talk about all this, but it's all fascinating, and I think it's actually something that's like probably currently on a lot of people's minds right now. Is 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 how information, particularly of intelligence type of information, will work in a Trump administration, insofar that you could shine any light on that. Of course, it's a new administration, it's a new set of people, and it seems to be a fairly like different set of circumstances that he's coming in on, to say the least. But how? What's your experience of information getting to President Trump that didn't fit with maybe his overarching narrative or the direction you felt he was going to? Did you feel like there was success at times of getting information there that was different from maybe the perspective that he might have outright said it, or you suspected he held, and you saw that change? I think that's probably like at the core of a lot of people's concerns.
Yeah, so he hates the intelligence community. That's the narrative. He hates the intelligence community. He hates intelligence officers. I just again, I'm a buff of history, so I'm sorry to be bringing in
Oh,
history.
please, yeah, that's great.
There's always been this tension between intelligence and policy. So intelligence is a profession, much like journalism, where you see the world the way it is. So your job is reporting. Your job is supposed to be reporting on what is happening. Whereas policymakers see the world the way they want to see it. There's this natural there's this natural friction. So the reality is that there have been very few presidents who've been incredibly enamored with their daily intelligence briefer. Um,
Mhm.
President Obama, for example, once told his intelligence briefer that when you walk into the room, you suck out my decision space. Because,
Hmm.
here you are, you're thinking that, the sky is blue and the intel officer is saying, nope, it's really gray. And so to be clear, this friction has been happening from the beginning of the creation of an intelligence community. It's the way it is. It's actually very healthy. So this natural rub um,
Mhm.
is not necessarily a bad thing. I think the difference now is that we have far more understanding about that relationship. There's far more that is openly shared about that relationship that has ever been shared before. And so, we know that President Trump didn't always like to hear what it was that he didn't want.
Yeah.
But he's not alone in that regard. Maybe there's more bluster, maybe there's more said, but he's not the first who's not been happy to hear what it is he has to say. Um, you know, I I've never briefed President Trump. When I was in the last administration, my boss was Secretary Pompeo. And so,
Mhm.
my focus was, our team reported to him and provided him with intelligence. And I have to say that he was I loved working for him because he was an avid consumer of intelligence. And that's what we love in the community. When your customer really wants what you do, that's where self-actualization comes from. And so, I would just argue that the intelligence community is not just about supporting President Trump. 17 of those 18 agencies support their secretaries or their lead military officials or law enforcement. And, their focus is getting work to the Department of Homeland Security or getting it to the Commandant of the Coast
Yeah.
Guard. And so all
Yeah.
of them make up our national security sector. There's one agency that supports the president, and that's CIA. And so, you know, eh, but it's 18 agencies that feed information to the president. And so I would say he won't be the first. Um, I don't know what it's going to be like going into this next administration in terms of his relationship with intelligence, how he consumes intelligence. I understand from friends that he actually was an avid consumer of intelligence, um, and that he did use intelligence. That's what we've heard out in the private sector
Yeah.
doing, but
Yeah.
I have to believe that he will continue to do that. So we'll see how it goes.
Yeah. I mean, we're kind of drawing here to close here, and I'd like to kind of shift a little bit back to the trust in media side of things. And particularly, I mean, it's just a pretty evocative name, particularly for a period in time when um, w- whether the media is more under attack now than it has ever been, which sometimes you claim is actually a question I've often had. Because there's always so there's been some friction, and there's also a great tradition of highly partisan media in America too. Um, and so, what do you think the role of media, particularly that media that isn't favored by the president, is going to be there? And I guess I'll just put my cards on the table. I worry about like a serious dysfunctional relationship that could emerge, um, you know, between some of these media outlets that many of us do trust, and the White House, who are sometimes pretty vocal in its distrust of it. I mean, could you give us a sense about what you think the next 4 years are going to feel like?
So I really think at the end of the day, we've been focusing very much on media from the position of those who produce media. So it's traditional media sites, social media sites. And at Trust in Media, we really are putting more focus on those who consume information, a better understanding of what is in their information. And so, what we found, especially during this last election, is that the way people consume media is very different. And it's also not a black and white issue. So there's a generational way that we consume media. So for example, I very much grew up in an era where it was traditional TV news, major news organizations, but my kids consume news in a very different way, and their relationship with media is very different. So the
Yeah.
media landscape has changed. And I think that's I hope that traditional media organizations are really thinking about this. So
Mhm.
when you look at the revenue model of traditional media, it tends to be to provide them information that supports the narrative of the folks that are paying for their media. Um, which means that we've moved a lot from news, from providing people things they don't want to hear, to providing people with commentary and opinion and giving them what we want to hear. We're feeding these echo chambers. And so I would suggest as we look over the next 4 years that, those organizations that are actually providing news, are providing what is happening. Colin Powell used to tell his intel officer, tell me what you know, tell me what you don't know, tell me what you think. If media organizations could apply that, you sort of that premise to what they're reporting, we're going to see some different outcomes. The challenge is that that's not how revenue models work. Um, People are consuming information very differently than they did now. If you look at how President Trump was communicating, his vision and how President Biden, or in this case, Vice President Harris, was communicating hers, they used different pathways. They had a different strategy. And now let's look at the outcome. So I would say that I hope the media organizations are being very strategic right now and thinking about, what how do they get information to their consumer? Tell them what they know, tell them what they don't know. Leave it at that.
Yeah. I love that perspective. It's actually something that we try to track all the time because it's people. So it's like we're coming out of a period, actually like a new period of consolidation, some period where like a few social media platforms really consolidated a lot of audience or eyeballs on it. And we're actually seeing a much more fragmented space in general. And that's part of like our challenge at Filter Labs is like, how can we make sure we're finding those places where people are still talking? And it's like, yeah, that's corresponding directly with where they're getting the news, how they're consuming it. Obviously the story that came out of the election was podcasts, were like big. But that's been around for a bit and we're seeing that. And I think it's a great mission on it.
Well, just to add that we talked about local. So, local media is in more demand than ever, but it's dying.
Fascinating. Yeah.
So, this again, it gets to where we started with trust. We need to come up with some mechanism to better share information at the local level. And I think podcasts fill in that gap because we're talking to one another. We're creating a trust.
Yeah. And it's more human engagement, and people do like that on it. Well, this has been really wonderful. Just here in closing, could you tell our listeners a little bit how to follow your work and how to follow the work of Trusted Media, how to engage with you all, if that's of interest to people?
Yeah, so our website is www.timcoop.org. Please visit us. We are looking for help. We're looking for folks who can help us with research on how people consume information, the standards of quality information, the measures, technologies that help people access information that they can actually understand what's in it. And so if you have ideas or you have capabilities, please, we want you to join us.
Well, yeah. Well, that'd be great. Well, thank you very much. This has been a lot of fun. And we went places that I didn't think we were going to go. But yeah, well, thanks.